start a section tonight on the Baptists, who are Baptists, and do some historical background of who the Baptists are. And first of all, we're on page 12 in your book. First question we have there is, why are Baptist origins so tough to trace? And there's several reasons why, but the first reason is we don't have any well-known single founder. When we talk about Lutherans, we know who founded the Lutherans. Martin Luther. We talk about Presbyterians, we know that John Calvin and John Knox were the founders. Methodists had John and Charles Wesley. They founded Methodist societies. They didn't really originally start a church. They just started Bible studies that became a church, a denomination. The Episcopals were started by King Henry VIII. And so on. We know all this by history, by looking at it, but when we come to the Baptists and we say, who started the Baptists? Well, we don't have one founder, one particular founder. The second thing that makes it hard to trace our heritage is many of the early Baptists only remained Baptists for a short time. These people were seekers, and as they came across the truths in Scripture, they tried to follow these truths as best they could, and so we see that they received baptism and became Baptists, but then as they continued to seek, they found other things and they became other things. A third thing is that many of the early Baptists were killed shortly after they became Baptists. In those days, it was very dangerous to be a Baptist. Today, we're the most widely, or the largest non-Catholic Christian organization in the United States, and so it's not as dangerous as it used to be. But you find that early Baptists, they were burned at the stake, they were hung, they were beheaded. The favorite way that different kinds of groups had of getting rid of Baptists was, you want to be baptized? Okay, we'll baptize you. So they would drown them, take them out in the middle of the lake, tie rocks to them, and throw them overboard in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Seems kind of ironic, but that was the way they dealt with it. And then a fourth reason is because some were not very careful in preserving historical facts. Many of these early Baptists were trying to prove a point. And so they were not careful scholars in preserving the facts in those days. And so we don't really have a good record of all of them. So that's the reasons why it's so hard to figure out where Baptists came from. But there are four theories as to where Baptists came from. The first of those theories is that it is an outgrowth of the English separatist movement. Now, you're going to hear, in this, you're going to hear a lot of American history. Because you think back to American history, the separatists, the Puritans, the Baptists were closely related to the Puritans and to the Pilgrims. In the 17th century in England, there was a movement within the Church of England to purify it. And so in that movement, people like Oliver Cromwell and you think Cromwell's cohort's name down. But they caused, there was a big war between them and the Royalists. And the Royalists were the ones who held on to the Church of England, and Cromwell and his groups were the ones that wanted to purify it. So they were the Puritans. But there were also some who thought, well, it's not good enough to take something that is wrong and purify it. You just need to separate from it and become something separate. And so through these outgrowths, the Baptists came. That's one of the theories. Another theory is that there's the influence of biblical Anabaptists. Now, the Anabaptists were groups on the continent of Europe that when the Reformation started, when Martin Luther started the Reformation, there were groups that took what he was saying and they tried to run it to the logical conclusion. Now, Luther's idea was that we have to have a state church because this is who's going to define us as people. It's going to be a unifying aspect of who we are as a people, as a German people. And the Anabaptists were those who said, no, according to the Scriptures, government and church really have nothing to do with each other, and so we need to separate the two. If you're going to be a follower of Jesus Christ, you need to follow Jesus. If you're going to be a follower of the church, or a follower of the state, then follow the state. And so the Anabaptists started to separate from the Lutherans, and they separated from the Calvinists, and they separated from everybody else to start their own groups. And these people were usually, well, there were 6 things that these people were known as, or known for. They believed in a believer's baptism, which was totally new at the time. Before, up to this time, everybody was baptized into the covenant of the church as infants, with the admonition to the parents that they would grow up as members of the church. They believed in religious liberty, that they did not have to be or could not be coerced or manipulated to conform to any kind of religious view. They believed in religious liberty. They believed in the separation of church and state. Jesus said concerning taxes, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. And so they recognized that, well, that sounds like a separation, doesn't it? There's the things of Caesar and there's the things of God. The state then cannot force anybody to pay their tithe, which part of the tithe then would go to the state. The state cannot force somebody to become a believer when that person doesn't believe, or to believe a certain way when that person doesn't believe that way. They believed in pacifism. They were pacifists. And that's the reason why they were persecuted so heavily. They were easily taken advantage of because they practiced turning the other cheek. Now, there was one exception to this. In the town of Munster, Germany, there was a group of Anabaptists that thought that the kingdom of Christ was coming, and so they were going to be ready for him. They went into Munster and they threw out the Lutherans, and they took over and they made it their own little village, their own town. And then the Lutherans attacked them, and then the Catholics attacked them, and not a great war, but a big war broke out there. And this was in 1525, and it gave such a bad name to Anabaptists in that one area that up into World War II, there was still some conflict there between Baptists and Lutherans. The leader of the Anabaptists, in fact, was put into a cage and lifted up on the church steeple. And when the Allies liberated Munster in World War II, they took that cage and his remains down. That's how long it had been there, 500 years.
At least I had multiple.
The Anabaptists were also communal. They would live in communities, in communes. Some people say they were communists, but they weren't communists because, you know, a communist says, what's yours is mine. Basically, thievery. But communalism says what's yours and what's mine is ours. And so we share it. And so the Anabaptists were usually farmers or hardworking, common people, and their communities would flourish in these early days of a free market. And that then led to more persecution from those that were still trying to live under the middle-aged serfdom concept, because these communities of Anabaptists were flourishing. And then they were known as being withdrawn from the world. The world was evil, and we're not to be of the world, and so they would separate themselves from the world. So one of the origins of where Baptists came from is that they were influenced by these people and by their thoughts and ways of life. A third theory is it was a continuation of Baptist teachings throughout the ages. The Baptist teachings, people who believe this theory would say that what you find in the New Testament is Baptist teachings, and in the 300s, the 4th century, there was a corruption that took place in Christianity, but there was always those people within Christianity that carried through the truth. And so these people eventually became the Baptists. And then the fourth theory is much like that, but whereas the third theory says there's a continuation of Baptist teachings, the fourth theory actually says that there was a continuation or a full succession of Baptist churches. And so you can trace Baptist heritage all the way back to the first Baptist. Who was the first Baptist?
Jesus.
No.
John.
John was the first Baptist. And Jesus was a Baptist because he was baptized by a Baptist. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous, but there's a lot of people that believe that. In fact, this theory would say then that the only real church, the only true Christians, are Baptists. Which one of these, you say, is correct, I think, the outgrowth of English separatists, because there's more historical evidence to say that who we are as Baptists is related to who the English Baptists were as they came over to escape the religious persecution in England. And as they came, of course, they brought freedom for themselves and persecution for others as they came and settled here. Any questions or comments about origins and theories of origins?
I'm just amazed that all of the church denominations, they split out, you know. I found out through a good friend of mine, he's a Presbyterian, his dad, they're really strong Christians, but there's like 9 different orders of the Presbyterian church, and he's of the original. We got, I don't know how many Baptists.
There's over 200 different groups of Baptists.
Baptists, you know,
and that's in the United States.
And that's just in the United States. Yeah. I just don't see, and the Lutherans the same way. They get the Missouri Synod, and then I forget what they call the other one, but that's the only 2 that I know of.
But there's 3. There's that one, 3? Missouri, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, and then
Wisconsin.
huh?
Wisconsin.
Well, there may be more than 3.
Yeah.
Because that sounds like a regional one.
How does that, you know, I mean,
How do the divisions come?
how do they justify it? I mean, we're
well,
talking about Jesus Christ, the
third
Lord
one.
and Savior, and how do we do this, you know?
Third, yeah, one of them was split based on homosexuality. That one was recent.
Right. That's where the Evangelical Lutherans came out of that split. The Missouri Synod was the big split back in the 40s or 50s, or whatever it was. And the splits have always been based on 2 things. It's been based upon, and this is across the board with every denomination, the splits have either come because of doctrinal differences, that usually the main group has digressed into some kind of a liberal way of viewing the scriptures and reinterpreting who God is and reinterpreting what it means to be a Christian. And so when that takes place at the denominational headquarter level, there's always a group that splits off to take what we used to be the traditional.
That's where I have a problem. These intelligent people that are well educated and everything else in theology and doctrine, and how can they go away from the Bible, what God says? It's the inerrant word of God. The Episcopalians here a few years ago hired let a queer be a bishop, you know, and he split. I mean, I don't know how much damage he's done overall to the Episcopalian church.
And there's been splits, there have been local splits among Episcopalians because of that. The other reason that churches split or the denomination split is personality driven.
Well, yeah, somebody don't like to cover the
Yeah,
front of the guy.
this guy, he doesn't deserve to be the leader. I need to be the leader, and
Yeah.
you know, half the people want to follow this guy, half the people want to follow
Yeah,
this guy.
you get
So,
like
you know,
human faults on that, you know,
Yeah.
and I can understand that. But what bothers me is that the people that are high in the hierarchy, that are so well educated in theology and doctrine and stuff like that, how they get so they can take off on their own and take their own people. It's kind of upsetting, you know, when you get to know the Lord.
Let's look at some key events in Baptist history, and from that we're going to get really into what shaped us as Baptists. And a lot of what we're talking about here, the splits that take place. Why do we have the American Baptist Convention, the Southern Baptist Convention, the Baptist Bible Fellowship, and the Independent Baptist churches, and all this? And we'll see some reasons for that. Here's some key events that took place in Baptist history. The first identifiable Baptist church was in Holland in 1609. Now, think back to probably 8th grade U.S. history. U.S. history or world history?
It's U.S.
Is it U.S.? Okay. When the Puritans left England, where did they go first? Holland.
Holland,
They
yeah.
went to Holland. And that group was led by William Bradford, who eventually came to Massachusetts and started Plymouth Colony. Well, one of the followers of William Bradford was a man named, now get this is going to be a hard name to get and memorize, John Smith. The reason it's so hard is it's not spelled S-M-I-T-H, it's S-M-Y-T-H. And as John Smith was in Holland, he became influenced by the Mennonites. We've got Mennonites still around today. But the Mennonites were the followers of Menno Simons, and they were Anabaptists. And so John Smith, and being influenced by the Anabaptists, received baptism. The baptism that he received it would be completely foreign to us because it was by pouring. They would take a cup of water and pour it over their head. And so he and a few followers then that were there in Holland split from the Puritans, split from William Bradford's group, and started a Baptist church there in Holland. That was in 1609. In 1611, one of Smith's followers decided that it was cowardly for us to run away from England and to start a church in Holland. And so he decided, rather than to be a coward, he was going to go back to England, and he was going to start a Baptist church there. So in 1611, Thomas Hillwise went back to England and started the church. And in 1613, he was killed. So that church didn't last long. Now, remember I said that these baptisms were done by immersion, by infusion, by pouring. They were also done because they didn't have anybody who they thought was authorized to do the baptism. Many times what these people would do is they would baptize themselves. And once they had one person baptized, then that one person would baptize the rest. And so, well, you got to get it started somewhere, don't you? I mean, how are you going to get it started if you want to do it right? Well, they did this by pouring, and in 1640 we have the first indication that the common practice among Baptists now by this time was immersion. They were starting to immerse. And so you see a progress then. As history goes on, also in the 1640s, Baptist churches in England began to form into associations. Now, the denominational structure that we have as Southern Baptists, the association is the unit that is closest to the local church. I mean, it's a lot closer here in Wind River than it is in Casper, and a lot closer in Casper than it is in Nashville. And so in our denominational structure, the association is still the closest structure. It's the smallest structure and the most intimate structure. But as we look at history, we also see that it was the first denominational structure that Baptists started. These were small churches, these were persecuted churches, these were struggling churches, and they would get together periodically to encourage each other, to study the Scriptures together, to involve themselves in missions together, to educate themselves. And so that's what Baptist associations have been ever since. It was in the 1650s that they actually began to use the name Baptist. Now you remember way back when we started this class, we were talking about the word Christian, and how the term Christian was given to the first believers by those who were outside. Baptist was the same way. It was a term that was given to the Baptist by those who were of the Church of England. But as they started to realize, yeah, this is what we do, we baptize. So they adopted the name themselves in the 1650s. The first Baptist church in America was founded in Rhode Island by Roger Williams in 1639. Roger Williams was originally a member of the Puritan Church, or the Congregational Church in Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he started coming up with these weird ideas about only believers should be baptized. And so they excommunicated him from the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the middle of winter, and he went and founded then Providence
Plantation.
Providence Plantation, yeah, thank you. He was baptized and started then the First Baptist Church in Providence, Rhode Island.
It's still there.
1639. Yes, it is. The building is still there. During the colonial period and the Revolutionary period, Baptists were often outlawed, they were beaten, they were imprisoned, they were killed in most of the colonies with a couple of exceptions. You remember again from American history, the Quakers founded Pennsylvania, and the Quakers founded Pennsylvania with complete religious freedom. And so Baptists flourished in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Those are the only places that they could find the freedom that they needed to be able to practice their religion as they understood it. But Baptists, because of their involvement in the Revolution, Baptists were highly responsible for the inclusion in the First Amendment in the Constitution. There were two very influential men. A A man by the name of Isaac Backus was a Massachusetts Baptist pastor who argued that since Baptists had fought in the war for independence and for religious liberty, their religious liberty should be guaranteed. It's a pretty good argument. You know, we're going to make sure that others' religious freedom is guaranteed. We should be included in that also.
And he got beat up pretty well for that.
Yes, he was pretty well beaten and put into stocks and sent to prison and ended up dying from the injuries that he received.
I think his wife was put in stocks and burned as a witch.
I haven't heard that, but
Yeah,
I know all these guys,
by
their wives
history,
suffered with it.
yeah.
Yeah. The second guy was a man named John Leland. Leland was a Virginia pastor, and through a series of letters that he wrote to James Madison, he convinced James Madison that there should be an amendment to the Constitution that guaranteed the freedom of religion. And so Madison was the one then that helped to do that. There was also some correspondence that took place between Thomas Jefferson and the Danbury Baptist Association churches in Connecticut. And this is where the phrase, the separation, a wall of separation between church and state, that's where this comes from. It's from these letters that were written back and forth between the Baptist churches in Connecticut and Thomas Jefferson. The separation of church and state, that phrase is not in the U.S. Constitution. But the phrase simply means that the state has no control over the religious beliefs of the people. In other words, nobody in Washington or Cheyenne can force us to be what we don't want to be and to believe what we don't want to believe. And so while that was included, Baptists played a major role in getting those things into the U.S. Constitution. Well, there are three major divisions among American Baptists that we need to understand to really know who Baptists are in America. The first thing is the general Baptist. These two words, general and particular, are used to talk about the views that they hold as to the death of Jesus. This says that Jesus died generally for everyone in general. The particular say that when Jesus died, he died for a particular group of people, those who would be saved. Their argument, their reasoning is that if Jesus died for everyone, then everyone's saved. But if Jesus just died for those who were going to be saved, then his death is really powerful to bring about salvation. In other words, if he died for the population of the world generally, and everybody's not saved, then that means that in some sense his death was wasted. Because he died to give the gift of salvation to people who did not receive the gift of salvation. Now, we might look at this and we think, hey, it's so stupid to fight over it. But as they drew their arguments back and forth throughout the 18th and 19th centuries especially, you start to see some major reasons why they would divide over these things. Because what if Jesus just died for those particular people who are going to accept him? And I don't know. I don't know who here that would be.
I know, who are these people?
See, we don't know.
Then now or
Nobody knows who those people are.
Those two ideas can really affect how you go about evangelism.
That's where I'm getting at. Because if you run this all the way to its conclusion, you don't need evangelism or missions. They're going to be saved regardless.
yeah.
In fact, if I'm going to preach the gospel, and there are those that are not going to believe, if I share with them the truth of who Jesus is and what he did, am I making it worse for them in eternity because now I'm enlightening them as to what he did and they have no way of receiving it? On the other hand, these people here start leaning all the way to the other side and say, it gets to what you do as to whether or not Jesus accepts you. We have it today. These would be the Free Will Baptists. I don't know if you're familiar. I don't know any Free Will Baptists up there. They do have a college over in Nampa, Idaho. But I don't think there's anywhere local here. Free will Baptists are just what the name says, free will. It's up to you. You do whatever you want to do. You know, if you want to be saved, you be saved. If you don't want to be saved anymore, then you can drop out of salvation. You don't have to be saved anymore. It's all free. It's free. Particular would be the Reformed Baptist. And there are a lot of Reformed Baptists. And this is a debate that takes place. It started in the 17th century, and we're still fighting this battle today. Did Jesus die just for the elect, or did Jesus die for everybody? My conclusion is that Jesus died so that everybody could be saved.
Yeah, well,
You know,
that's what
regardless of whether you accept him or not, he still died for us.
does this come up at your SBC conventions?
Yes, and this is something that just within the last few years has risen its head again. There's a segment of SBC leadership that has been saying that our Southern Baptist heritage has been particular Baptist, we've been Calvinist, we've been Reformed, and they produce all this historical evidence to show it, and then there's the other group that says, no, we haven't always been. We've been general, and they produce all this evidence to show it. And actually, when you look at this, because you've got those who say they're Calvinists and those who say that they're Armenian, which is what general is, and you put them together, and what you realize is that Southern Baptists have been right here all along.
If you, in particular, Baptist goes back to predestination,
Yes.
which is Calvinism. And those people believe that God has already chosen you because he knew you before you were ever born. And he knew that you were going to become a Christian, and so you're going to Christian. It makes no difference what you do. You're going to be a Christian.
That's right.
And Baptists don't go to the general, but we go into the middle, because even like the thief on the cross, there was two there, and this one says what he's going to do, and the other one condemns him. Jesus said, and you'll see me in paradise. So that man made that choice.
Right.
But the Calvinism would say he didn't have a choice to make. He did it because he was going to become a Christian.
Yeah.
And of course, so Baptists do believe mostly in the middle. Calvinism, you know.
There are truths in Calvinism, and there are truths in Arminianism, which is the opposite of Calvinism. But I think the greater truth is that area between them. Because you find two things in Scripture. You find Jesus saying, all that the Father gives to me will come to me, and I won't cast them out. And then you find, whosoever will may come. And you've got then to realize that somehow, in a way that our minds cannot understand, but somehow God chose us and we chose Him. Somehow. And that's that area right here between. And that's where most Baptists fall, and always have fallen. These are the extremes. But these extremes have been very important in U.S. Baptist history, because that has created who we are as Baptists along theological lines. The second thing that's here, this is really good for history. Sandy Creek tradition versus the Charleston tradition. In 1755, a group of Baptists in North Carolina along the frontier at Sandy Creek started a church. And that church was very evangelistic, it was very mission motivated, and so not only did it start a church, it started several churches, and those churches started to grow. And these churches were on the frontier. They were growing fast, and they needed leaders, they needed pastors, and so they looked in their own congregation and they started to say, you can be a pastor. And they didn't send him to college and seminary. They didn't educate him. They just sent him out as a pastor. These churches were very emotional. These churches were highly animated in their church services. Their preaching was get right or get left, hellfire and damnation type of preaching. And they began to define what Baptist churches were along the frontier. Charleston, and I illustrated it with these church buildings. You know, here's a country church. And here you got a cathedral. The Charleston tradition from Charleston, South Carolina, one of the oldest Baptist churches in the country, their tradition was that they wanted a pastor who was highly educated. They wanted a pastor who was an organist. They wanted pipe organs. They wanted high-class music. And so you start to see what that conflict is there. And we experience that conflict in churches today. In looking at those two, and just the brief that I've given you about those two, what would you say our church is? Are we a Sandy Creek Tradition Church or a Charleston Tradition Church?
I'd say Sandy Creek.
Yeah. One of the problems that really happens, because you still have these kind of churches today, one of the problems that really happens is when this kind of a church calls that kind of a pastor.
Boy, that's a bummer.
Yeah. What kind of problems could you see would happen?
A lot.
He's preaching way up here using
Yeah.
words they don't understand. And,
Or the other way around.
yeah, or the other way around.
This guy's got his own garden
Yeah.
in the backyard.
And so this becomes something that is very important in defining who we are as churches. And it's not always recognized. But if you visit around, if you go, and I'm not going to encourage you as church members of United Baptist Church to visit around, especially on Sunday morning. But as you look around at other churches, you're going to realize that even within Wyoming, we have these two traditions. We also have blendings of these two traditions. We have some churches that their music is top quality, high class, almost operatic. And then the preacher gets up and he's a spit holy fool, just making a fool of himself, telling people to turn or burn. And these traditions, when they blend, it's really an amazing thing. But usually they don't blend. Usually a church is one or the other. And the mistakes come when you make an assumption that you're a Sandy Creek church when you're a Charleston, or if you assume you're a Charleston church, you're really a Sandy Creek.
But it's pretty interesting when you drive up from the south, like I did last week. You'll see 4 churches. The buildings are in need of repair and unpainted. And then you get to the Charleston type of mega church,
Yeah.
and there's more than that.
Oh yeah, yeah. And that's because these will tend to be larger.
Yeah, big cities.
The mega churches, our Charleston tradition. This tradition here can very quickly multiply because you don't need trained leadership. You train the leaders as you go along.
Yeah, there's one about every block or every mile.
Yeah.
So.
The only ability their leaders have are availability. If somebody can wear the shoes, we'll make them a pastor, a deacon, or a Sunday school teacher. The third difference is the difference between a society and a convention. Now, this is really a difference that we begin to see between Baptist churches of the north and Baptist churches from the south. Missions have always been the heartbeat of Baptist churches from the very beginning. You think Thomas Helwise, I'm a coward if I stay here in Holland. I've got to go back to my people. From the very beginning, it was mission. But we've always not agreed on how to support missions. What's the best way to support it? In the early days of Baptists, there were 2 ideas on how to support missions. There was the society and there was the convention. The society method could be described as a loose coalition of interested individuals. They didn't have to be connected to a church, but these people would focus on a single ministry. And so, let's say you got a group of people within the church that were really concerned about orphans. So we're going to have an orphan society. And they would begin to solicit the church members for support for their orphan society. And then they would go to other area churches and they would say, we're wanting to get some support for our orphans, and we have this area orphan society, and we'd like for you to become a part of it. And every person has that individual responsibility or ability to say yes or no as to whether or not I want to be part of this society. So because there is no central organization, planning and the pooling of resources in societies becomes somewhat inefficient. Plus, what happens if you got Church A and Church B, and in Church A you've got some people that say we want to have a society for orphans, and in Church B, you've got some people who say, you know, I think we need to have a society to support orphans. And all of a sudden you've got two, and they're feeding off the other churches in the area, and there's no pooling of the resources, and everybody's doing their own thing. They're duplicating efforts. This puts a lot of strain upon funds and personnel. But on the positive side, societies allow churches to pick what they think is important, and to say, we think supporting orphans is important, so we're going to support the society. But over here you've got someone who says, we've got a tract society. We want to get gospel tracts out to everybody. Well, we don't think that that's as important as taking care of orphans. So we're going to take care of orphans, and you can go ask other churches to help support with your tract society, your literature society, or whatever. So churches then had the ability to choose what they wanted to support, and there is little denominational control over this method of supporting missions. And there is more church input into the societies. Now, the convention method creates a strong denomination that's built around churches that send messengers to a central body. This body of messengers, they're the ones then who plan ministries and sponsor the ministries and carry those ministries out beyond the local church. This creates a centralized plan. It creates a centralized funding so that efficiency is greatly improved, and it makes it possible for each church to be involved in a variety of different kinds of ministries. The kinds of ministries that they could be involved in otherwise if they hadn't joined together in a convention. But there is then the potential that this denomination will become something that is massive, a machine that's going to take away from the autonomy of the local church. It's going to be a bureaucracy. There's going to be all these different layers of bureaucracy and authority within that. And the people in the pew then are not really going to know what's going on denominationally. So they both have their pluses and minuses. The point is that the Northern Baptist churches chose the society method. They thought that this held on to the autonomy better than the convention method, and so they looked at this as being most important. The Southern churches chose the convention method because they were looking at what is the most efficient way we can do missions. And so eventually from the convention method came the cooperative program, where every church designates a portion of their receipts, put it together in one pot, and from that one pot we get a group of messengers, people from all of our churches, who decide here's how we're going to distribute it between foreign missions and home missions and education and the other things that we're going to be doing. And so churches in the South are convention churches, and churches that have ties to the South are convention churches. But churches that are in the American Baptist Convention, in the Conservative Baptist, CBA, the Conservative Baptist Association, the Baptist Bible Fellowship, the International Baptist, IBWE, International Baptist for World Evangelism, they're society churches. They take one area of ministry and they focus then on that one area. The convention churches, we look at everything that we think we need to be doing, and we find then a way to fund and to resource those ministries and those missions. When a thought went through my head, it didn't stop long enough for me to remember what it was I was going to say.
As you were saying this, to me, we had a perfect example of this in the last 2 weeks. We had the group that came from Africa.
Okay.
The Horizon is an outfit which basically is probably a society group. And so then therefore you give your money to that group and you help that group. The one over here, just like what you were saying, they say, okay, we're going to help orphans, we're going to help this group, we're going to help this group, we're going to help this group. And the only way we can do that is get an organization of churches to give their money to his convention.
Right.
And so I thought that was just like what we've had
Yeah.
here lately.
That's good. That's a
Good
good
example of what
Because
both
that's
of those
exactly
are.
what that was, yeah. Well, you look at it, we had this, but we've got this going on too, is we're doing our Annie Armstrong. Because that offering goes to the convention, then to support, now specifically, that one offering goes to North American Missions, but what we do on a weekly basis is we give 10% of all of our receipts to the cooperative program, and that goes to do missions in Wyoming and around the world. I remember what the thought that came through my mind now was about societies. The way that society churches do missions, it has, in my opinion, a great drawback in that their missionaries cannot be on the field as often as our missionaries can. Because their missionaries have to keep coming back to the supporting churches to find more support or to renew their support. What happens, for instance, if a church is going through some really difficult times? Say most of the members of a church were members or worked at a factory, and that factory closed down, or that factory had a major layoff. Now, you know, the income of that church is going to drop drastically. And so the leadership of that church is going to sit down with their budget, and they're going to realize, hey, we've got X number of dollars not coming in. That means from our spending, we have to cut that much. Where are we going to cut it? And so they look, they say, well, here we've got 25 missionaries that we're supporting. And of this 25 missionaries, this guy, we haven't seen him in 3 years. This guy, we haven't heard from in a year and a half. We don't know what he's doing. Is he still there? You know, whatever. So let's cut these guys. And so it's important then for those missionaries to keep coming back to their supporting churches and say, give a report of what's going on. Now, in one of our churches here, there's a large group of people that have come from another Baptist church, and they're saying, you know, I've been a member of this church for 4 or 5 years, and I haven't seen our missionaries. Where are our missionaries? And the pastor's answer was, they're out in the field doing missions. Because they don't have to keep coming back here and asking for money. Because we work through a convention. And as we work through a convention, we see to it that their resources are there and taken care of. And so, when you look at who we are as Southern Baptist, as United Baptist Church, we would have to say that we're pretty much, we look like this.
I know that 10% of our receipts go to the association. But, okay, so we get our money, we send 10%. Where does the 10% go to? Does it go to the convention down south, or does it go to Casper?
It goes to Casper.
It goes to Casper. Then they take a piece.
They take 32.5% and send it to the executive committee in Nashville.
In Nashville.
The executive committee they have a budget that is set. When we meet in June in Houston at the Southern Baptist Convention, we will set the budget for, I guess, 2014. And they then, according to what the budget is, they will allocate the monies that they get to the different agencies and boards. Currently, it is 51% of everything goes to the International Mission Board. That's our missionaries overseas. 40-something%, I'm not sure what it is, 42, 43, goes to the North American Mission Board. And then, is it 42?
I think it's 2.
Okay. And then the rest of it then is divided between 6 seminaries, the ERLC, Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, and some other, and that's the last lesson that we have in here. That's
Okay.
we'll look at
I
that
just
one.
didn't know how it started to be
Yeah.
split out.
So, you know, we send 10%, and Hillcrest sends, I don't know, we'll say 10%, and then Risen Sun sends 10%, and this church sends 7%, and this church sends 4%, and so on. So by the time, over a year's time, what's accumulated in Casper will be $600 and something thousand, which is a considerable amount. It's really not enough to do what we need to do without help from the other agencies
No.
giving back to us. In fact,
Considering our population, then you come down from
actually,
there.
what we do, the money that we send on to the North, that ends up at the North American Mission Board, for every 5 cents that we send out, we get 95 cents back. So So that's a pretty good deal.
And
Now,
when-
it's not that way everywhere, but it is in Wyoming.
And our church splits it, not doesn't split it, but then we send the 10%, then, and what do we send the association, 5?
4?
4?
Maybe 5.
All right,
5, I was thinking it's 5, but
then. Yeah, but-
Yeah. And that's, all the churches in the association do the same thing. They'll send 4 or 5%. Our treasurer is Annette Baxter, she lives over here on Forest. And she gets the money from all the churches, and it's in an account. From that account, we have resources that are available in the office. Things like this projector, it's not my projector, it belongs to the association. So,
and part of your salary comes from that.
yeah, part of my salary, part of my travel comes from that. Part of my retirement comes from that. Part of my operations come from that. I've got money that's like, I'll take Dean out to lunch every now and then. I try not to do it too often because he gets to rely on it. I don't want her to be dependent on it.
You know, I could go.
But all of the pastors and their families, Charlotte and I, when we go visit, we'll take them out to lunch.
Well, I think the wonderful part of that, though, is the spin-off from that, is that, like when you built this church, the missions that came, or they came and done stuff to set free and huts and, you know, and all the things that they do, the spin-off from that, I think, is phenomenal. I've never known an association to do
And that's,
that much.
you know, lots of times we talk about resources as our money, but resources is more than that. Resources are the people. Resources are the equipment that we have. Resources is the knowledge that we have.
Yeah.
You know, just within our churches, there's probably not anything that's ever happened in a church that somebody in our churches hasn't dealt with before. We can share that knowledge.
Yeah, the diversification of all the industries from professional to layman, you know, it's just wonderful.
How, Dale, do you remember, because I don't, what percentage of your salary when we first hired you came from the convention?
I don't know the percentage. The amount was $500 a month.
500 a month. And then
That
it
was-
decreased it for 5 years.
That was on a decreasing scale. Every year, the $100 would go off, and it was originally set up that way because knowing that small churches couldn't pay a pastor's salary, so the North American Mission, or at the time the Home Mission Board is what they were called, would give $500 for each church, and that amount decreased because the idea was that as the church grows, then they'll be able to make up that $100 difference. And, you know, how many other denominations do something like that to make sure that their churches have a pastor on the field?
You know, it's,
We've changed that policy a little bit, and now we only give that money to new churches to keep their church planting pastor on the field. And so they have within the first 3 years of their existence to apply for that money. And it's not $500, it's $750, and it drops off 20% every year for 5 years. But anyway, that's who we are as Baptists. That's where we come from. Next week, we're going to look at what we call the Baptist distinctives. You know, there are beliefs that we have because they're from the Bible. Every other Christian denomination holds, you know, more or less loosely to these. But there are certain things, there's a certain mixture of those beliefs that make a Baptist. It's like when you're making a cake. You know, you can start with flour and eggs and salt and sugar and milk or whatever you put in the egg or in the cake, and you can come up with a cake. If you alter those ingredients a little bit, you're not making a cake. You might make biscuits instead, you know, or might make a pie. But it's the same ingredients. And so we're going to look at the ingredients and how they're mixed together to create this unique thing that we call a Baptist.
What we were just talking about was the reason my dad left First Baptist Church and came to the First Southern Baptist Riverton, which is Hillcrest, is because of the exact same thing. They had a missionary come in there, and he'd been sent to Africa, and he was over in Africa, and back then it was late. It was a letter.
Because they couldn't afford it.
Back in the 50, probably 2 or 3, and the guy come in, and he's going over someplace, and they said, well, we haven't heard from this guy for 3 years. And they dropped that guy, and they financed this guy. And Dad says, how can you do that? That guy's over in Africa, and he has no money.
And he's relying
And he's
on what we
relying on
send.
us,
Yeah.
and we're gonna just cut him off because we haven't heard from him for a while, and we're gonna sponsor this guy.
yeah, he's out on a battlefield,
Yeah,
You don't have a ticket home.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, we
so
just
that
gotta
really,
find-
that really upset my dad.
Rightfully so, because I know they come, the missionaries come over here, support.